Good evening, and welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You. We're looking forward to showing you our interview later on with Welsh Minister for Climate Change and Housing, Julie James. We pre-recorded the interview last week, given the Minister's busy schedule. There may be one or two references that are out of date because it's been a slightly complicated week in politics. And by the way, these aren't devil's horns. The Minister suggested that we had as our theme hometowns. And as you'll find out, I've chosen the Birmingham Bull. Unfortunately, when I chose this, I didn't appreciate that if I sit in the middle of the thing, it just looks like I'm Satan. I'm sure that's entirely a coincidence. Anyway, talking of famous Satanists, Paul, how are you doing?
I'm very well, Charlie. How are you?
I'm extremely well. Where are you? Have you blurred out the background because you're in a car park again?
I dared say that.
You are! How did I guess?
It's the grand reveal. No, I've just finished an inquiry in Hertsmere and about to head to the cold north. So I've had nothing to drink, so I'm just drinking water today. But cheers, nice to see you.
Cheers,
my Lord Satan.
Mary, how are you?
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, Mary Cook, Town Legal, and I'm sitting here having my lovely cup of Yorkshire tea in the Town Legal offices.
Fantastic, great to see you. And Chris, how are you doing? You're looking unfamiliar surroundings. Dare I say, slightly less grand than your usual location?
Well, if you just look out behind me, you can see the epicentre of Tory panic because I'm in Amersham. And in the planning world, that just means chaos. Not that there's not a bit of chaos, obviously, already in the Tory party. No, I'm here at Amersham in an inquiry for a site in Beaconsfield, instructed by Mike Davis, and we're in front of David Rose, who is always a superbly charming inspector.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Chris. And Sasha's stuck in an inquiry, but going to be joining us shortly. And I should have said, of course, at the beginning, the usual call to arms to please consider making your usual charity donation to either one of our nominated charities, Shelter, Brian May's Save Me, or the Ukraine GoFundMe page, or, of course, a local charity of your choice. Now we're going straight to the case reports because, as I said, the guest is going to be with us in the second half of the show via our pre-recorded segment. So we're going to start, Chris, with a case appeal decision from Bolton you're going to cover.
We are. It's a decision of Inspector Hartley. I don't know if Rob can bring up the details of the screen. And what we've got is a proposal by Bellway Homes in respect of a CS inevitably going to be developed. It's the site that's other protected lands in the Bolton allocation plan, and it was common ground that the whole of the appeal site fell within these areas, but also that they didn't fall into any of the categories where development might be allowed. So it's a significant development when you look at all the different phases that are proposed, phases 3, 4 and 5 on top of an existing development site. Now, there's a huge amount here about landscape and design. What I wanted to focus on was just the issue of coalescence. I don't know if we've got a photograph of the site, but there's a coalescence issue between Dob Brow. These are places that Paul will know. Dob Brow and West Horton. And the area was the subject of appeal for all of these sites. And the inspector raises this issue about coalescence. So paragraph 25, he says, at the inquiry, there was a considerable discussion about whether the proposals would result in coalescence of Dob Brow and West Horton, the rest of West Horton. I have to say, I don't even see that. I can't see any gap at all, such there be coalescence. They're all part of the same settlement, which is pretty much what the inspector took the view. At 25, furthermore, in my view, the passerby perceives Dob Brow as being contiguous with the rest of West Horton. I find that it's not a discrete and separate area, notwithstanding the views expressed by the council's witness at the inquiry. It's relating to separate access and nearby open land and vegetation. I have to say, I just can't see the coalescence point there at all. It is all part of the same settlement. Anyway, the inspector went on to consider it. Paragraph 26, Said he considered the form and the density and the setting of the existing settlement. But he said in the second sentence, while the proposals would result in some infilling and extension of the existing consented settlement to West Bolton, I do not find the development as a whole would seek to erode an important separate function between the urban areas. Put another way, he said, I do not consider the proposals would in fact lead to coalescence of discrete urban areas. And he made reference to coalescence in the council's planning documents. And then finally, paragraph 27 on this. This is quite interesting. Even if one were to disagree with my view about coalescence, a finding that the proposal would lead to coalescence would not, in this case, outweigh my overall conclusion in respect to the appeal proposals. And what he's saying there is, even if I'm wrong about that, I'd still have allowed this appeal, even if I thought there was coalescence. And that's a very sensible thing for inspectors to do in terms of insulating themselves against criticism if a different conclusion might have been reached. There's only two other things I wanted to highlight. Street trees, they get mentioned. Paragraph 45, the inspector was forced to consider the issue of whether there should have been street trees in the design. Now, you remember, if you go back a few Secretary of State, you come to Robert Gendrick, and he was very keen on street trees and insisted that be put into the MPPF. So that's his lasting contribution to the British planning system. Unless he makes a comeback, of course. I recognise that street trees, the inspector said, would not as such be provided throughout the development as a whole, but the appellant's design response has been drawn by Highway Authority adopted requirements. I'm satisfied that in respect of footnote 50 of paragraph 131 of the framework, clear, justifiable and compelling reasons were given by the appellant, and in any event, the evidence is there is scope to provide plentiful tree planting. So when it's raised like that, what Robert Gendrick has done is made it necessary for decision makers to expressly state there is exceptional reasons, really, why, or justifiable reasons, why street trees are not provided as part of the proposal. And then finally, just on this issue of the status of the land, paragraph 6 in the decision deals with the issue of other protected land. And as you can see, that was the status of this land. And then finally, the inspector's conclusion on that issue is contained paragraph 69. He said, furthermore, the council confirmed at the inquiry the OPL would be required to help boost the shortfall in the local planning authority's 5-year land supply. There was no dispute. The council had only 3.3 years or 3.9 years between the parties, but well below 4 years. And the appeal site was the least sensitive of the OPL sites in the area. So how did this appeal happen? You've got a council that hasn't got a 5-year land supply. You've got land that is potentially future development land. And you've got a council saying this is the least sensitive, as a consequence of which, not surprisingly, the appeal was allowed. Well done to the appellant's team. That included Paul's stablemate, Giles Cannock, and well done to the rest of the team. And Nicola Jacob of Randall Thorpe was acting on the other side. But Jonathan Berry at Tyler Grange, Simon Pemberton at Lichfields, well done. A good outcome.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, there's quite a few major decisions on coalescence recently. The Topsham one, if Sasha joins us in time, he was going to kind of also concern coalescence. Clappers Lanes in Chichester, there's one or two others as well. It's always seemed to me a little bit strange when land isn't designated for an anti-coalescence reason, either in the local plan or as green belt, as some sort of freestanding coalescence point. Always seemed to me to be a little bit curious as an in principle showstopper in that situation. But there we go. I'm going to go next. Sasha was going to join us next, but so he's still stuck in his inquiry, but hopefully will tell us about Topsham later. And I'm going to deal fairly briefly, because it's quite a lengthy decision, of the high-profile refusal of Inspector Katie MacDonald to confirm a compulsory purchase order for the acquisition of land to facilitate the regeneration of the Vicarage Field area, including Vicarage Field Shopping Centre and adjacent land in Barking and Dagenham. Now, this was a scheme which had planning permission, and an inspector found in her conclusions there was a compelling case for it, extremely compelling case. It was wholly in accordance with the development plan. the shopping centre and the town centre overall needed redevelopment. It was the lowest ranking borough in London for poverty. This was the scheme that was the catalyst for regeneration. There were no realistic alternative proposals to the scheme. And the inspector was completely aware that failing to confirm the CPO would lose the opportunity to comprehensively redevelop the site, and the council staked its reputation on delivering it. So all of that, you must think, well, obviously, no brainer. Well, no, it was not. It was not a no-brainer, and she refused for, well, I dare say, very coherent and compelling reasons. And the reason was viability. The inspector noted that there was sufficient funding behind the CPO. There had been debate about whether the people, the commercial entities behind the proposed development actually had the funds to deliver it, and she found that they did. But that wasn't enough, because she found that no rational commercial investor, no matter how much they invested so far, would in the circumstances invest more money to deliver the scheme if they weren't going to get an adequate return. That's obvious common sense, obviously right. And the difficulty was that the outline planning permission, the governing outline planning permission for this scheme, had been granted at a time when the viability appraisal for that scheme had found the scheme to be substantially unviable, and the permission was granted in full knowledge of that. Nothing wrong with granting a permission for unviable development in principle in most situations. But of course, for CPO, it's different, because you're taking someone's land, extinguishing businesses in some instances and interfering with their rights. And if that's for a scheme that is pie in the sky and isn't going to happen, then there's not a compelling case. And the inspector found it unusual in the context of the lack of evidence, or in fact, the positive evidence of a lack of viability in the past, unusual and surprising that there wasn't an updated viability appraisal showing the scheme was still viable. The authority had claimed, well, no one had taken a viability point. She wasn't very impressed by that plea. It's the responsibility of the acquiring authority to provide the evidence to generate the compelling case in the public interest. The onus is on them. Again, that's plainly right. And even if there were commercial sensitivities, the inspector was impressed by David Elvin's submission on behalf of one of the lead objectors. One of the other ones was, of course, Chris, that a updated appraisal could have been either redacted or subject to some kind of confidentiality ring, potentially even with just one expert seeing it, on undertaking viability and commenting as a peer review whether or not there was indeed viability, a viable scheme. And that would have, in the inspector's view, provided independent and clear indication the scheme was viable. So lesson learned. I mean, clearly that this means this highly beneficial scheme isn't going to happen. The reputation which the inspector said the council had staked itself is clearly going to be affected by the failing, frankly, of the council to provide the evidence that it should have done. I mean, being frank, embarrassing outcome for the council. But a lesson to be learned from that is, if you're promoting a CPO, provide evidence that the scheme is viable, and don't hide behind commercial confidentiality, because there are workarounds. And if you take the risk, you may find that no matter how good the scheme is and how impressive the case is, you don't get your CPO confirmed. Now, very quickly, in a couple of sentences, one other case that you should be aware of, didn't quite make the cut, Arnold White Estates, a case about tree felling. I wasn't completely aware that pretty much any felling of any substantial trees required a license, it must be said. It's not really my field. But it turns out that generally speaking, it does. And if you get a license in advance of your planning permission, and generally speaking, in advance of either full permission or an RM, reserved matters, then like the Court of Appeal's judgment, there's a real risk that implementing the planning permission will lead to a breach of the standard restocking conditions, which require replacement trees to be put in place and maintained for 10 years. And the Court of Appeal rejected the argument that the planning permission overrides the conditions on standard conditions on a felling licence, which can't be changed. So the lesson from that case, which is actually really important pragmatically, is if you are going to have to fell trees for a envisaged development, get your planning permission first, and get indeed either full permission or reserved matters first before you apply for felling licence, because if the felling of the trees is necessitated by the planning permission and you haven't got a license already, you'll get an exemption from the license. But if you get the license first and the planning permission afterwards, the permission doesn't trump the license. So it's about sequencing. Get your permission first and then your felling license. So it is resolvable, but care needs to be taken. Finally, I should say the barking case, you want to hear more, Raj Gupta, Mary's colleague at Town Legal, has posted a series of very interesting and detailed blogs about that, available on LinkedIn and the Town Legal website. And with that, if we haven't got Sasha, Mary, over to you. And you're going to tell us about a case in Chris's hometown of Cheltenham.
Indeed, I am. Indeed, I am. This is an appeal against non-determination by Robert Hitchens in respect of their application for 250 homes at a place called Harp Hill. And this is an unusual inquiry because there were 3 Rule 6 parties, 18 witnesses, and the inquiry sat over 20 days remotely. So there was a lot for the inspector to consider. The County Council were there as Highway and Education Authority, Cotswold Conservation Board were there as custodians of the Cotswolds AOMB. This was a major development in the AOMB, and there was also a local residents group. There is a 2020 core strategy and a Cheltenham plan. So they are, on the face of it, there are some allocations, but indeed the inspector found on this greenfield site, there were conflict with the spatial policies, especially the one that said that any additional urban extensions, if required, would have to come through a local plan review. But one of the features of the case was that the inspector was with the appellants on the point that there wasn't a timely timetable, as it were, for a plan-led review of the local plan, and thus the identification of more sites. So it was agreed, unsurprisingly, that this was major development. And so really the ultimate issue was, were there exceptional circumstances, a la MPPF paragraph 177? And this is a careful 31 pages, 127 paragraphs. There's a lot in this. In regard to the AOMB and the impact on the AOMB, the inspector, unsurprisingly, found 250 homes would represent a fundamental and permanent change in the character of the land. But the highly unusual feature in relation to this site was said to be the fact that it was surrounded on 3.5 sides by residential development. And so development would be seen in the context of the existing built parts of Cheltenham. So although he was clear that there would be adverse impacts on the AOMB and that the proposal would not conserve and enhance, he said there were site-specific factors which diminished that harm. Less than substantial harm to 4 heritage assets, all Grade 2 listed buildings. There was an interesting tussle for highway engineers. This was a scheme that had an environmental assessment. Inside there was a chapter on transport. That chapter assessed the impact of the scheme up to 2024, but they were required to go up to 2031 because the local plan period ran that for that distance. And there was a great deal of argument about the use of temporary growth rates. So what they had to do was assess the impact of the allocated sites, and the county was also then applying temporary growth rates. So for all those who are interested in that sort of nuance, I recommend reading the decision. The appellants succeeded in demonstrating that there would not be significant adverse impacts in terms of highways. There was also an interesting battle on education, again, for those who, particularly on this issue of permitted admission numbers and whether or not schools had or didn't have capacity. One sometimes hears education consultants and county councils argue that if a school is at 95% of its PAN, then it's at capacity or not. And in this case, the appellants were saying that capacity should have represented 105% of PAN, but the inspector went with the Education Authority's 95%. Clear and urgent need for market housing and affordable housing. No substantive evidence of harm to tourism, which was alleged because of the harm to the AOMB. And in terms of the tests in 177, so clearly a need, And in terms of the cost and scope of potentially developing outside the designated areas, whether it was AONB and Greenbelt, he said really there was very limited scope in this part of the world to do that. And anyway, the plan-led approach wouldn't provide a timely solution. And the other crunch point was his description that this was an obvious and logical extension to Cheltenham. So congratulations, Paul Tucker, KC, and his team, because they demonstrated exceptional circumstances and got their permission. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Mary. Well done, Paul. And in a nutshell, the Topsham case of Sasha here, this is one of mine, I can recall the main issues. No development in the gap between Topsham and Exeter, which is protected, amongst other things, for anti-coalescence reasons, doesn't necessarily result in coalescence. Point number one. Point number two, Exeter hasn't got a 5-year supply and is quite well below 5 years. Point number three, therefore, all the land designated, greenfield area designated under policy CP16, which is their catch-all land outside the settlement boundary policy, a reasonable amount of that has to give way, and therefore the fact that you're contrary to that policy isn't a showstopper. Overall, permission granted because there wasn't a lot of harm, lot of benefit, substantial weight given to both market and affordable separate benefits. And lastly, of some interest beyond Exeter, the request by the NHS for employment related contributions to deal with the demands on their budget was rejected, in line with an earlier case we covered a couple of years ago, Wilbur Barton, and indeed one or two other cases. There've been a couple of cases going the other way. So this is another one on the side of not giving the NHS trust in question the money they need, on the basis that there are other ways they could get it and other ways they were getting it. So that's of interest more broadly. With that, we'll say goodbye to you until 2 weeks from now from ourselves live, and we're now going to play the recording where Paul is going to lead a fascinating interview with Minister Julie James. So over to you, Paul, or rather the ghost of Paul past.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
So, good afternoon, Julie James, MS, Minister for Climate Change for Wales. What an absolute joy to have you on the show. We've been trying to have you on the show for an awfully long period of time. And more properly, I should say, Pranda, C2T.
Yeah, Diane, diolch. It's a real pleasure to be here.
I'm delighted you're here. Good. So first of all, I'll introduce your many achievements in just a moment. But before I do, it's traditional for guests to identify a theme for the show. What's the theme that you've selected, Julie?
I think we went for hometowns, and I can see that you're wearing a scarf. Obviously, I'm a big supporter of the Swans, and count myself as a very proud Jack. So who are we? Jack are me.
Yeah, I'll invite Charlie maybe to join in with a song later on. Mine is that my hometown is Scarborough. So this is from the last season before Scarborough went bust 11 years ago, when they played against Chelsea in the FA Cup and lost, but at least I was there and I bought a scarf. So, Julie, you've had a remarkable background. You toyed with the idea of joining us at the bar. So for my own personal career, I'm delighted that you aren't there out competing me at the bar. Before deciding, having travelled around the world as a child, before deciding to come back to Wales and to delve into a career in politics. You, I think, became a deputy minister back in 2004, and you've had a variety of different portfolios and rising to your current eminent status.
So not 2004. I wasn't elected till 2011. So 2014.
Oh, right. Okay. 2014. Wikipedia now needs to be updated. Excellent. That shows the flaws in my research.
He does that a lot.
Right. So Julie, I've got a few questions to ask, and then I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to dive in with some questions that they have. So the first question that I have, and this is from somebody who's done a number of inquiries in Wales over the years, particularly towards the start of my career. Things are different in Wales, but one of the things that's different is that the furtherance of the Welsh language has been at the heart of the planning system in Wales since the English and Welsh planning system split in the mid-1990s. And we can see from the census that Welsh language speakers have increased dramatically, so that in the most recent census, we're at the levels that we were in terms of absolute numbers at the turn of the 20th century. So firstly, how important has the planning system been to securing that increase in the number of Welsh speakers? And do you think the aim of 1 million Welsh speakers by 2050 is achievable?
Yeah, so it's been very important, the planning system, but obviously it's one of a suite of measures that we use to increase the use of Welsh. I'm talking to a load of professional planners here. I'm very aware, but obviously the planning system isn't about the development of a linguistic policy. So it's not a direct tool in that sense, but the Planning Wales Act has a very specific requirement in it about planning around the Welsh language and being cognizant of the likely effects on the Welsh language of any particular planning policy that you have. We're very in general, in the plan system in Wales, we're very keen that our plans take into account our places and our people, and they think about the community that they're hopefully enhancing with their plans. And much of that will be around making sure that a majority Welsh-speaking community does not have too many people added to it at one time to dilute the effect of the language. That's not to say that those communities shouldn't grow and that people shouldn't go and live there and come in, but obviously a huge influx of people at the same time would make it much harder to keep the language as the living language, the first language of that area. So a slow, proportionate add-ons to our communities. And then the second part of that policy is to make sure that the planning system delivers the right kinds of employment land and links and so on that enables the young people in particular to stay in those communities, because the two big threats are incoming non-Welsh speaking people. And I can't emphasize enough that incoming people are very welcome, but just not in overwhelming numbers. And then the other big thing is the drain of young people away from those often rural communities to the cities, and then the loss of the language as a result of the aging of the community. So we think the planning system has been pretty pivotal in delivering some of that, and then coupled with many of our other policies, of course, which encourage the use of Welsh in schools and the use of Welsh in everyday language, and the throwing in of pecha bachin, little phrases in Welsh in your everyday conversation, just has started people being very proud of the language. And the last thing I will say, since we started on a hometown football theme, is that you'll notice that even all the English-speaking fans of the Welsh national team all sing the Welsh songs enthusiastically, and that kind of cultural coming together has really helped the language grow as well.
It's not just football, it's also rugby, I have to say.
Yeah. Oh yeah, well, absolutely.
So in fact, it's interesting because one of the leading things in terms of Welsh policy is community cohesion as being a material consideration, which very much Welsh policy is led. So probably following on from that, this month there are changes coming into force to change the GDPO or the Welsh version of the GDPO to introduce subcategories in terms of dwelling houses for short-term lets and also houses that aren't being used for sole or main residences. Now, there's other second home policies elsewhere in the United Kingdom, but this is a change to the GDPO. So can you tell us what the intention is behind those changes? And do you think Wales is leading the way in which other parts of the United Kingdom will follow?
Yeah, so this is part of a suite of measures that we've been taking to try and decrease the number of unused homes in large parts of Wales. One of the very splendid things about living here in Wales is that we live in a very beautiful place. If I was to look to my left now, I'd be looking at an incredible view over the Bristol Channel. But the downside of that is that large numbers of people want to live there, and they've been coming in numbers over COVID and so on, as is the case in many beauty spots across the world, just to say. I mean, obviously not just Wales. And I can't emphasize enough that we're not saying we don't want people to do that. We just don't want them to do it in such overwhelming numbers that the communities that they're coming to be part of actually die. So, people who want to come here on holiday want to come to thriving, bustling communities with pubs and shops. They don't want to come to ghost towns where all the little businesses have closed because they can't sustain the winters and so on when there's nobody around. So we've had a real problem with that lack of a mixed market, is that what I want to say, or what I want to call it? And so what this is just another tool in the armory of the local authority in particular, to say that in areas where there are very large numbers of either tourist accommodation houses or second homes, and there's an issue with definitions which I'm sure we could go into at great length, then it gives them a way to control the increasing numbers. So it doesn't roll it back, but it does control the increasing numbers. And then we have other policies around grant assistance and so on, trying to roll some of it back. So just to give you an example, in one area in my own constituency in Swansea, I have a row of 100 houses, and there's not a single permanent residence in that entire row. So, I mean, clearly that's not sustainable. The local pub is under pressure, it's just really problematic. So if we could get that back to a mixed economy, then everybody would be it would be more sustainable, and we'd be all a lot happier. So the change of use thing, you'll know much better than I how the planning system works here. So we put that in as a national policy, and then the local authority can do what's called an Article 4 direction, assuming they have the evidence and so on to do that, to take the presumption of an easy change between the use classes away, and to require planning consent to swap between the two. And that's just one tool in the armory of local authorities in their attempt to get these sustainable mixed communities in place.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, looking at it as a really interesting way around what's done elsewhere in Cumbria and Cornwall in terms of local occupancy conditions, which is really a huge amount of work for the lawyers as much as anything else, particularly when it comes to definitions of what the local areas are. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that pans out in practice. So my next question, slightly moving away from the issue of social cohesion to the issue of the consequence of the Grenfell fire. So following the Grenfell fire, the UK government sought to pursue a pledge from developers to remedy what's called life-critical defects in buildings that have been constructed since 1992, which are over 11 metres tall, albeit without any legally binding agreements from manufacturers. So you announced as the Minister on the 7th of October a similar pledge for Wales, and I think 9 developers were signed up as of yesterday, but knowing my research on Wikipedia, that's probably vastly more now.
11. It's 11.
Yes. I knew it would be wrong. But you also expressed disappointment that the UK government had decided to pursue an England-only approach to the pledge. Can you tell us what the pledge is? And more generally, what does it tell us about the future of the development industry if the UK government pursues an England-only approach in relation to an issue of this importance?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that we were cross with the UK government for their actions here. They acted as if they were the English government, not the UK government. And, it was very disappointing. We had robust conversations with the minister at the time about the fact that was unhelpful. It's clearly unhelpful because the size of the market in Wales is such that if you split England away from Wales, then obviously developers who work in both are going to concentrate on England before they come to us. We have much less leverage in that sense. And it was even more annoying because we'd actually started talking to the developers in advance of England. And then once they started, of course, we had trouble keeping their attention because the market is so much bigger in England. So I can't hide it, very cross that was done. We had a change of minister. I'll try to not make too many remarks on how many changes of minister, but anyway. And the next iteration of the ministers were a bit more sympathetic, and they worked a bit better with us and helped us to get our developers back round our table, although it had been separated at that point. And we've been successful in doing that. All but 3 of our developers have signed up now to our pact. Several of them have actually started remediation in the buildings, which I'm delighted to see. We have a whole separate set of stuff going on here in Wales to get proper surveys done of all of our buildings. We understand exactly what the problems are. We've always said in Wales that this is about more than the cladding. The vast majority of our buildings don't have a cladding problem. In fact, they have compartmentation problems and fire escape problems and fire breaks in their walls problems and all sorts. But the cladding itself hasn't been the major problem. The ACM that we did have in Wales has been remediated. So, but there are, other forms of cladding are available that are nearly as problematic. So, I was frustrated in the extreme. I have yet to meet the new Levelling Up Secretary of State, but there is a meeting in the diary for, I can't remember, the end of October sometime, and I'm hoping that they will continue to cooperate with us. We've got a pact that's been developed for Wales, but it's largely the same as the English pact. It just references legislation as it applies to Wales and not as it applies to England. It's slightly different. And we'll have the same legal document backing that up for obvious reasons. It's much easier to have it as similar as possible, but again, referencing Welsh law rather than English law. And I'm very pleased that the developers have got that far. We have a couple of other things going on in Wales that they don't do in England. So we have a buyout scheme here for people who are in severe financial hardship. Not as many people have got through that as I'd have liked. So I'm about to review the criteria to widen it out a bit. We know that some people have just been trapped in lives that they would have liked to have moved on from and haven't been able to sell up and so on. And we have to work with the UK government on talking to people like lenders and insurance companies, because again, the market here in Wales is too small really for us to be able to compete for attention, if you like, for those people, unless the UK government does it with us. And the Scots government are in exactly the same position. So they were just as mad as us about the separation for no good reason as we saw it. And so, yeah, I really hope we can continue to work with the UK government, because there are a range of other things still going on with those buildings. So we are going into the remediation phase now in Wales. We've got 55 buildings with a complete survey done, 163. We had 219 expressions of interest that had desktop surveys done. We've got 163 of those needed intrusive surveys. We've got 55 of those completed. So they're obviously on a rolling program. We can start the remediation work now. We're working with the developers to make sure that really complicated things like making sure that specialist workers and supply chains and equipment and all that sort of thing, that we have a pipeline of work for that. It's very hard to explain to the leaseholders. They're all desperate. That even it's not about the money. Even if I had all the money in the world, which I haven't, but even if we did, actually, just there aren't the workers to do the work. So we're trying to get a pipeline going so that we've got a continuous supply of skilled workers and whatever to do that. So we've been working with the development companies and with our own surveyors to do that. And the government here has paid for the surveys to be done so that we are happy with the outcome of those. And if you like, we own the intellectual property of that. So there's been some interesting fancy legal footwork about who can rely on it afterwards and so on, which I'm sure you'll all be familiar with. But yeah, so, it's been a lot slower than I'd have liked, and certainly a lot slower than the leaseholders would have liked, but I do think we're getting there now.
It's very difficult, whilst trying to be apolitical, not to say very well done in relation to that. And I have to say, having read your press release in relation to that, your polite anger shone through. You would have honestly made a fantastic lawyer in terms of the drafting of that particular press release. Entirely different question now, one very close to the heart of all the panellists. In England, at public inquiries in relation to residential development, 5-year land supply is now the absolute staple. However, PPW used to have a commitment to maintain a 5-year land supply in Wales, but that's been an approach now that Welsh policy's moved away from, and now one judges delivery against the housing trajectory within an up-to-date plan. And that's been said to be a commitment to a plan-led approach and to restrict speculative residential development. So the first question, is it working? And secondly, how do you determine whether it's been a success?
It's a little bit too early to say quite whether it's working. It certainly has restricted some of the things we didn't want. So we had a lot of speculative green site development along the M4, for example, or applications for. We are very determined here in Wales to move to sustainable communities, sustainable neighbourhoods, active travel, 20-minute communities, all that kind of stuff, away from the build it over there and stick a road up to it and it'll be fine kind of approach, which, I do not approve of in any way for a large number of reasons. So this approach is to put more focus on the local area. We have a strategy for how they work out what the local market housing assessment is. It's a complicated calculation that they do. We work with the local planning authorities to understand from them why they've allocated particular sites. So we've done a whole big exercise with them around this site has been earmarked for housing for, since my father was a boy. Nobody's ever built any houses on it. What's going on? Take it out of your plan, please. Some of those have been because they have really good reasons why they haven't come forward. They've on contaminated land, or there's some other big issue with that. So we have grant aid systems for that. So we have a big stalled sites fund, and we have a contaminated land fund. So we help our SMEs get over the affordability problem of trying to remediate land before they can build. So we've been able to release some of those sites for housing development. Others when you get there and you see a 1 in 3 cliff, you're like, don't think anyone ever was really going to build any houses here. So this is about, in my layman's terms, getting a realistic housing supply in place on land that could realistically be have housing put on it, and that would build us the sustainable integrated communities we'd actually like, close to the other services and infrastructure. And I think, as you know, we're trying to put a regional strategic plan in place, program in place as well. And this is to link with the strategic plan so that we can help our SMEs understand what the regional infrastructure plans look like and what, therefore, they might be asked to contribute to and so on when they're bringing sites. So it is a plan-led approach. It's very much about making sure that so we have Future Plan Wales, so we have the national strategic approach, then we'll have the interim regional strategic approach, and then the LDPs coming in underneath. And in that way, we're hoping that we will give more certainty to our house builders, and particularly our social house builders as well, as to what the infrastructure looks like, what they might be asked to contribute to, and frankly help along our negotiations for our various 106s and highways agreements and so on, because we'll have a bit more of a planned understanding of what that might look like. So that's the theory, but it's all very new. We don't have a regional plan in place yet. The proof of it will be, do we have the right houses in the right place? Because that certainly hasn't been the case up until now. I really do think that this will do that. And we work very closely with our local authorities. We have a very good relationship with them, and they have all been very much on board with this. And I've spoken at the planning conference here in Wales about why this is a good idea, and my Welsh Government planners have spoken to all of the planners in all of the local authorities. It's one of the big benefits of being a small place where everybody kind of knows each other, that we can really work together to get this doing. But it's a bit early to say whether it's been successful yet, but we live in hope.
And the exciting message at the end is regional planning is coming back within Wales. Let's hope the message gets through to other parts of the United Kingdom. So more power to your elbow on that one as well. I was going to ask you about renewables, but I'm going to allow others to come in. I've got one final question, if I may, Julie, and that's this. My practice, my chambers are based in the northwest of England, and that's been my home for the last 30 years, and it's had historic and physical links and economic ties to North Wales, obviously. But it's always struck me as being odd that the physical links between the north and south of Wales are rubbish, both in terms of rail and in terms of the road. It seems crackers that, I've left inquiries in Flintshire to go and look at sites in Bridgend, and I've had to come down the M6. It always strikes me a bit odd. So if budget wasn't a constraint, what would be the grand project that you would wish to propose to try and meld together those two parts of the Principality?
Electrified rail. It's the short answer to that. So actually we are working on that. We have a political deal with Plaid Cymru called the Cooperation Agreement, which is a pretty unique kind of way of doing politics, really. So they're not in the government with us, but we cooperate with them on a number of projects. We're a minority government. And one of those projects is looking at the rail links between between South and North Wales, but actually also between South Wales, West Wales, and West Wales and North Wales, because that's also an issue. And yes, if money was no option, then I'd upgrade the Heart of Wales line and electrify it, and hey presto, we would not be building roads. We have a road review underway at the moment. We're about to announce the results of, where we're trying to shift the whole assumption away from build a road and everything will be fine. So you'll know that there was a massive controversy when we refused to build the M4 relief road, so-called, across 5 SSSIs in the Gwent levels. I make no apology for being delighted that we didn't build that. We are looking to improve the public road structure around there, public transport structure around there in a big way. And it's been really interesting over COVID, actually, that a large amount of the traffic that was on there was quite clearly people going to public sector jobs at very set hours of the day. And because we've moved away from that pattern of working, a lot of the congestion has changed. Hasn't gone away, but it's changed. So patterns of working are really interesting as well around there. We have a target here in Wales to get around 30% of our workforce working from home at least part of the week, or working from regional hubs, actually, more likely, not home, part of the week. So we've got a big push to that. But our transport strategy, which is called Llwybr Newydd, which just means new transport strategy in Welsh, is all about reducing journey times for Wales and border connections into from Ireland across Wales and into England. We were very much plugged into the European Union transnational network, so we've tried to keep hold of some of that. We have, I don't know, how long have we got in this podcast? We've got a lot of issues with border controls and so on now, because actually a very large amount of freight comes across from Ireland through Fishguard, Milford Haven, and more particularly through Ynys Môn, Anglesey. So we've got all kinds of issues with border control posts and all the rest of it, but we've been lobbying the UK government to not move away from the interconnectivity west to east through Wales, but also, we do have that north-south connectivity issue. It's a very pretty drive, mind, if you're not in a hurry.
Oh, it's absolutely glorious. It's completely glorious. One of my favourite drives is down to Llandrindod Wells. It's absolutely fantastic. So, Mary, firstly, before I ask you to ask Julie your question, can you tell us how you've responded to Julie's theme?
Well, this is difficult for me because I'm a forces brat, and I was born in Germany in a military hospital. And when I was a child, my father moved around every 18 months or so. So I didn't really feel that I had a kind of hometown. But the nearest, and in Julie's honour, I have to confess that I spent the first 5 years of my life in military barracks in Germany. But then my parents had a dream posting to a wonderful place in Wales called Pendine, where Pendine Sands is a 13-mile beach. It's absolutely epic. And so Pendine, I'm going to choose Pendine as my hometown.
Well, you're very welcome. Croeso.
And your question, Mary?
Pendine is glorious. That's
it
where
is
all
absolutely glorious.
That's where the speed trials were done, of course, as well, because of the flat, lovely beach there. Yeah.
Indeed. There was a rocket range. My dad worked on the rocket range. So back to planning for a minute. My question, Julie, is about the sequential approach that the PPW advocates. And I want to understand how successful this has been, particularly in the delivery of affordable housing. And the other thing that PPW advocates is the idea of deselection. You mentioned your plan-led approach, but PPW is also saying if you've had sites which are going nowhere, then you should deallocate. And I wondered if that threat, as it were, has also been successful in ensuring the delivery of homes.
So again, these are all relatively new things that we've been doing over the last, 4 or 5 years, really. And so it's a little bit early to claim success for some of them. But we have been more successful than we had been previously in getting brownfield sites to come forward. We've got a couple of big kind of exemplar projects running. There's a big one in Caerphilly, which is an old tar works, which we're working on. And the Welsh government has tried to put its money where its mouth is. And we've started to develop what we call exemplar sites on land that we owned or we've been able to acquire to show what can be done on brownfield sites and what can be done with housing developments, of mixed use housing developments with green infrastructure and so on, trying to show people that, you don't have to kind of stack them high and build them cheap to be able to make a decent place that people are prepared to buy into. So I'd say that it's a work in progress, that we're constantly talking to our planning authorities about the priority ladder, if you like, but you must look at suitable, sustainable, previously developed land first, and then you can go to underutilized sites, and then you can go to edge of settlement sites, and only then can you look at greenfield. And even then, when with greenfield, we go through a pretty strict process of why does it need to be here, what's the infrastructure impact of that, what the biodiversity, etc. is, all of that. We've also got quite a lot of kind of active travel requirements and so on. So we want to see sites that are linked properly into non-car dependent routes to work and services and so on. And then there's a special justification, as we call it, clause for why on earth something rolled forward that didn't have housing on it before is still in the LDP. We've been quite assertive about LDPs. So as the LDP has been going through its various processes, the Welsh Government planners have not held back at all from putting in their own comments on why this plan does not conform to various parts of the policy. We had a very interesting conversation in Monmouth just before, at the beginning of this year, where they were putting all kinds of speculative housing in because there's a big demand from people in Bristol to come across to Wales where it's just a bit cheaper and so on. Very public spat with them. I'm not saying that this was any part of it, but in May there was a complete political change of ownership of that council. Had a rather better conversation with the new political leadership there. It definitely had some part of it because I think people actually don't want their green countryside built on. So it definitely had some role to play in that. And that's been an interesting kind of case study, if you like. And then, as I said, we've been working hard with our local authorities. This isn't necessarily combative. We've been working hard with them to understand, why is this site still in your LDP? It's been there for the last, it was in the unitary development plan, for goodness sake. It still hasn't got any houses on it. What's the problem? And then trying to work with them about, what are you doing with this? Are you really thinking that it will have housing on it? Does it meet any of the new criteria? Why don't you deallocate it? And you'll know that there are lots of complications with that. Often people who've got allocated land have used it to borrow money and all kinds of other stuff. So, we do work with them to try and understand what the process for that might be. But we're very keen, that this housing, allocated land for housing, actually gets housing put on it. So it's not
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julie.
No problem.
Chris, how have you responded to Julie's theme, and what's your question?
Thank you very much, Paul. Hello, Julie. Well, my theme is my family live in England. I grew up in Droitwich, but we're mostly Welsh. My great-grandfather was the Bishop of Llandaff.
Oh, really?
His brother was the head of the Trade Metal Workers Union in Llanelli. My grandfather was called Gwynfor, and my sister is a planning officer in Monmouthshire, where I guess she'll be putting her feet up for the next 10 years because she's in development control. But leaving that to one side, I think the feeling was that actually it's a Labour council now, but the Conservatives wanted to deliver more affordable housing, and they knew they had to do it through cross-subsidisation. But I don't think it was just about people from Bristol, but I know what you're saying. Now, my question is, it's always about housing. The rest of the panel know this. My question is about housing. Back in 1974, you delivered 16,000 houses in Wales, and now it's about 4,000 or 5,000. In England, the government introduced the idea of boosting significantly the supply of housing. And just before the pandemic, we got to nearly 250,000 new homes with huge numbers of affordable houses, cross-subsidised, vast numbers. So the question is, you've got rid of 5-year land supply. A lot of your plans are beyond their end date. About half of them are beyond their end date. They haven't got allocations in for the current period. They've been rolled forward, I know. How are you looking to boost the supply of housing in Wales?
Yeah, so this is really complicated, isn't it? So we have a number of issues in Wales that, bits of England will have, and not all of England. And you need to break the figures down really to get a better comparator. So we have land value issues, for example. We don't generate as much land value out of the sale of some of the land as you'd expect, and therefore we have big problems with delivering affordable housing supply. Often the ask starts at 20% and is dropped to 8% by the time the development is up. We've been trying to push all publicly owned land up to 50%, and we've had some success in that over the last 10 months or so, but it's relatively new policy. We've got a massive problem in Wales with the state of our special areas of conservation rivers. We've got a huge problem with phosphates and nitrates going into our rivers. We've just passed agricultural pollution regulations, which basically prohibit any development in the flood zones of those rivers until we can sort out what the contribution to phosphate nitrate is. That is holding up a large number of new homes, private and social sector homes. In Monmouth in particular, actually, they've got one of the hits, the Usk and the Wye coming through there. We're working at some speed now to get nutrient management boards into those rivers and to try and work with the house builders for what we can do to make sure that the housing doesn't contribute to the runoff into the rivers. I mean, it will make the houses more expensive, which will exacerbate the problem I just talked about. Monmouth, previous council in Monmouth did have some interesting things about bringing forward subsidised social housing by building private sector, but we had a bit of an argument with them, I'm afraid, about green belt and exactly where they were building it. So we won't get into that now. We'd need 3 hours, I think. But I think it was. We're looking for a rather better mix of social and private sector housing. And we're also looking for pepper potted social housing. So I'm very not keen on a development that has market housing up one end and social housing down the other end with a different entrance and all the kind of divisive stuff you get in communities that goes with that. So there are some other more complicated things going on here. We've had, so we've got a big push at the moment with our registered social landlords and our councils to up the ante on the amount of homes that they're commissioning direct. We've put a record amount of investment into that, very, very much higher investment over the last 2 years. But of course, now we're hitting inflation, aren't we? So we've, just as I managed to lever the investment in, I've now got the problem that the grant intervention rate on social housing has gone up really very, I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but it was certainly about 85,000 per house before. It's up over 100,000 now. It might even be 120,000. So, we're in real problems in terms of how much our money will buy as well. We were slow in Wales to, after the Conservative government allowed us to uncap the HRAs, we were a bit slow in Wales getting our act together to do that. So that was a bit behind some of the English regions, not all of them. And so if you watch the acceleration curve, it was a year behind. So they are ramping it up now. Some of the RSLs have done really well this year. And I am still hopeful that we will deliver the 20,000 low carbon social homes that we have in our manifesto commitment. But, unless we can do something about the inflationary spiral and some of the issues that we've got on the global supply chain for some of the things we need for that, we are struggling a bit. A lot of them have timber in them. We import about 80% of our timber at the moment, although we're busy planting trees. That won't kick in for another 15 years and so on. So I'd say to you, Chris, that we've got a lot of the stuff in place that will ramp it up in future years, but we're still in the ramp up phase for some of that. And then the last thing I would say is that the way that the housing market has been working in Wales over the lockdown and the last year has really impacted us. So the kind of exodus from the cities and the second home thing and the driving up of prices and so on, that's really caused us a difficulty. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the housing market now. I'm old enough, I'm afraid, to remember the various things that went on in the 80s. So I really hope we're not going to get the kind of crash that happened there. But the house price bubble here in Wales has been, in here locally to me, the house prices are going up by 47% annually. I mean, it's just unsustainable in anyone's world.
Just quickly, do you think building more houses and more cross-subsidised affordable houses would help that? Because we've got house price inflation, more houses, and is there a commitment to solve the phosphate and the nutrient issues? Because, the British government are doing that now really quickly. Are you looking to do the same?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got to solve it. We've got to solve it to stop the rivers dying, and we've got to solve it to stop our house building and our various industries having real problems. Of course, we've got to solve it. So we're going at pace with our nutrient management boards and all the rest of it. We're working with 2 water companies in Wales to understand, what their overflow outages look like and all the rest of it. So yes, there's a huge piece of work going on about trying to solve that. And yes, absolutely, all the stats show you that the more social housing you built, weirdly and counterintuitively, the more private housing you get. So we absolutely accept that. So that's why we've been ramping up the investment to do that. But we've got some other stuff going on in the housing market that's gone against us. So I think if we hadn't had COVID, you would have seen a big ramp up in those 2 years, and that's really that caused everyone problems, isn't it? And it's about how we're ramping up what the ramp up looks like afterwards. It'll be interesting to see what the stats look like at the end of this year now, because they're wobbling about all over the place at the moment. So for example, we've got fewer starts but more completions this year, which doesn't make any sense to me, but there we are. That's where we are. So we'll see where that goes. But yes, we're really keen to do that, and we do watch the English regions really carefully to see if there's any learning. I talk to the Scots government all the time about similar problems, and actually we've been in touch with Cornwall County Council, because they have a large number of the same problems that we have. So just trying to understand, how that looks there. Similar kind of skewed property market. So Cornwall has all the same problems as we have. We have very low land values in some parts of Wales and ridiculously high housing bubbles in other parts, and really big problems about none of the houses being in the right place for the right communities and so on. But we certainly don't think we've got all the answers, Chris. We've tried to set our local authorities into the best position to bring forward the best kind of housing in their area, and at a speed that our markets can manage. Our SMEs can actually build. We don't have that many volume house builders in Wales, 4 of them really, and they only ever work in the southeast.
And last but by no means least, the man who's offering all sorts of opportunities for inappropriate comments, bull and horns and all sorts of things. So I'll move away from that. Charlie, how have you responded to the theme, as if it's not blindingly obvious? And then secondly, what's your question for Julie?
Thanks, Paul. Good afternoon, Julie. Well, my late father, though he was born in Liverpool, was actually ethnically 100% Welsh. And he used to tell me that his great-grandmother didn't speak English. She was a sole Welsh speaker. But by the time I came along in 1980, the Banners lived in Birmingham, where the Commonwealth Games have just been held, the famous bull, which I have to sit on the side of the screen, because if I sit in the centre, it looks like I'm wearing devil horns, which is rather unfortunate. Brainchild of former guest on this show, Andy Street, the Mayor of the West Midlands. Now, Julie, I've got a couple of questions relating to the balance between housing and the environment. And the first one is it's your portfolio as a minister, as Paul outlined, is impressively wide. And includes both housing and climate change. And Wales, like the rest of UK, as we know, is experiencing both a housing crisis and a climate crisis. But often it's said that the solutions to one exacerbate the other, and vice versa. So can you tell us, to our viewers, what's your strategy for dealing with both these crises simultaneously in a way that's financially viable and deliverable swiftly?
Yeah, so we think it's a real mistake to put them in combat with one another. I think if you look at either of them in isolation, you end up with a situation which really does not help. So I think in all the things I've been talking about, you can see that we talk about sustainable communities, we talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods, we talk about active travel, we talk about making sure that people don't have to get in a car every time they go out of their house, that they have a house that they can heat at a reasonable cost using, decarbonised energy where at all possible, and so on. So, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that these things are easy, but we can use the planning system to start to build in all of those kinds of fit for the future modelling that we have. And we know, that where we have had sort of build them fast and stack them up type developments in Wales, that people there have real problems with fuel poverty and, other issues, that they can barely afford to run the car to the work and all the rest of it. And we've had really interesting conversations with people who live in kind of landlocked, new build places where they've got to get in a car to go anywhere, about how restrictive that is for their employment opportunities and for their educational opportunities. And that's not really a living community that you can expect to grow old in, and so on. So we're very keen indeed to look at the kind of viability of the whole place when you're putting these housing allocations in, so that the housing contributes to a community, that these aren't just isolated developments of people who never speak to each other and just get in a car and drive off every morning. Because we know that people who live in those kinds of communities pull much less resource out of other public services because they're much happier, healthier, cohesive communities. And I do really think that you can use the planning system to get a net benefit for biodiversity and to manage flooding and to get effective green infrastructure and to get a mix of housing types. So we always talk about mixed developments. We know we want to learn the lessons of the past. So we don't want single tenure housing developments of either sort in Wales. And we want different densities. We want, good high density communities in the appropriate places, and we want obviously lower density, good green infrastructure in some of our communities. And I spoke earlier about the Welsh language issue here as well, and that whole issue about growing our communities at the appropriate speed to make sure that they retain the viability that they would otherwise lose. And you can see that all over England, in fact, where you've got a development the size of the village on the side of the village, and the whole village just starts to crumble, really. So we're really keen to make sure that we have a proportionate response to that, and that we don't have just exponential sprawled growth all over our countryside, and, frankly, do away with our unique selling point, which is that, Wales is beautiful and very biodiverse.
Here. Well, thank you. Well, in a similar vein, the Oxfordshire County Council yesterday announced that it's not going to participate in the government's new investment zones programme in England. And its leader, Liz Leffman, said, and I'm quoting her, "We consider that the deregularisation of planning controls and reductions in environmental protection, which appear to be a condition of any investment zone, are incompatible with our net zero carbon aspirations and our commitment to protect and enhance biodiversity and environmental quality, as stated in our vision." Do you agree with her that the government's gone too far in sacrificing environmental protection for the sake of growth?
I certainly do. And I don't think it's necessary either. I think it's one of those myths, really, that, you find a March for Tuileries butterfly and you hold up the development for 5 years or, whatever. And that's just, those are urban myths in my opinion anyway. And, people, you can build a sympathetic development in a biodiverse area. You don't have to decimate one to get the other. And, well, I don't want to be too political in this programme, but I'm not sure that announcing that you're going to do a bonfire of the planning laws from the central government really works, because pretty much everyone is going to say, what a great idea, not where I live, though. So I'm pretty sure that when it actually comes down to not where I live, that they're going to have real problems with that. Very, very few people don't want any planning controls where they actually live. They just think it's a good idea for other folk. So, and the investment zones has a whole pile of other problems as well. So I come here from Swansea. I don't know if any of you know Swansea, but it has a huge development just outside it called the Enterprise Zone. That was a low tax, low thing, come here, whatever. And it didn't work. All that happened was it displaced things from anywhere else. And as soon as the tax incentives were removed, they all disappeared again, leaving us with an absolute wasteland of ridiculously low, rubbish buildings and all the rest of it. And then we got an out-of-town retail park, which promptly killed the city centre. So I'm not impressed by that. I think sometimes it's important to understand that these things have been tried elsewhere, and there are reasons why they didn't work in the first place. So we would take some real persuading that was a good plan for us. And I mentioned, I think in an earlier answer, we've had this conversation about the free ports. We're not keen on that either, for exactly the same reason, but we've negotiated with the UK government a slightly different set of things for a free port here in Wales, which includes our fair work arrangement. So we don't want a low wage economy, built on exploitation, frankly. And we don't want barracks type housing for people who are coming in to do work, and we don't want this kind of displacement investment, if I can call it that. But, there are some things you can do with a free port structure that are really helpful to us. And we certainly don't want our ports not to be able to, we don't want Holyhead not to be able to compete with Liverpool for obvious reasons. So, we've had to look at that. And so we'll do the same thing with the investment zones. We'll see what exactly is proposed, exactly where it's proposed. What do the incentives look like? Do we think that's just going to displace things from our city centres? We're very keen on a town centre first policy here for all our development, trying to get life back into our town centres as the whole retail universe is turned topsy-turvy and, the big shops all disappear. What on earth is going to happen in our town centres? So, yeah, you can hear I'm not a fan.
Thank you very much indeed. Paul, back to you.
So yes, thank you very much indeed, Julie. That's been absolutely fascinating. And since everybody else has been claiming their Welsh ancestry, I'm going to do the same. So if you just allow me to do this, so I'm going to claim Welsh royalty rather than anything else. So if you go into the entrance at Twickenham, on the left-hand side behind me, you'll see this rugby shirt. That's my great uncle Ben Grono's shirt.
Is it really?
He was the first man to kick off for Wales at Twickenham, the first man to kick off for anybody at Twickenham. And he captained Wales at both rugby union and also rugby league. And I used to play with his caps at my uncle Gwyn's knee as a child. So I'm claiming Welsh royalty on that basis.
So you should as well. And just to say, and this is a very Welsh conversation now, we're almost certainly related then, because I'm related to the Gronos on my mother's side.
Really?
So we're probably, yeah.
Well,
everyone,
then. Well, in that case, we
everyone in Wales is related by the time you get down to fifth cousin.
Oh, well, on that basis, diolch yn fawr. Thank you, Julie.
Diolch yn fawr. Lovely to see you all.